Hey guys, how's it going? Okay, so in this video, we are going to go ahead and build this React weather application that's going to fetch data from a weather API and display it right here on the screen. Okay, so before we dive into it, I'm just going to give you a quick demo of how it's going to work. So right here in the UI, I've got a couple of input tags. The first one has the name of the city, and then the second one has the name of the country. So if I type in Manchester, which is where I am, and then I type the UK, and if I press this get weather button, I receive this live response from the weather API. So in this case, I've got location, which is Manchester GB, Great Britain. I've got temperature, which is 0.27, the humidity 93%, and the conditions, which is a bit misty right now. Okay, so it may seem like a very basic application, but there's actually quite a bit going on in terms of React components. If you don't know what React components are, don't worry, we will go into details, but for now, just know that React components are just small chunks of UI code put together into one single component that we can render out to the web browser. Okay, so in this case, we have a title component which contains these two titles. Next up, we have a form component which contains these two inputs and the button. After that, I've got this weather component which shows the weather data, and then I've got this main wrapper component which contains everything that's inside of this app. Okay, so how do we actually build this project? Well, if you have not worked with React before, then before you even begin working with React, you need to put some basic configuration settings. So you have to first set up a Webpack file, and then you have to set up something called Babel, and Babel is what transpiles the React code into normal JavaScript code that the browsers can read. And the process of configuration is a bit tedious, and this is why I'm going to skip the configuration in this video, and instead I'm going to use something called Create React App to build this application. Now, Create React App is a command line utility that's been developed by the folks who created React, and essentially it allows you to get up and running with React as quickly as possible without worrying about the configuration. So as you can see right there, it says create React apps with no built configuration. So how do we actually work with Create React app? Well, before we go any further, I want to let you know that I expect you to be familiar with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and NPM before we build this application. So first of all, you need to install this Create React App package on your machine. Okay, to do that, open your terminal, and I'm going to shut down the current process. I'm going to say clear. I'm going to cd to my home directory. And the first thing that you need to do is you need to type in npm install create-react-app-g. What this is doing is it's telling npm to install this Create React App package globally on your machine. And this is what this G flag stands for. It stands for global. So install this package globally on the machine. So you can run it. So you can run this command anywhere in your machine or from any folder. Okay. Now I already have this package installed, so I don't have to do it. But once you have tapped this, press enter, let it do its thing, and then you'll be good to go. So to check that you have correctly installed this package, just type in create-react-app-version. So if you get given some sort of a number there, yours could be different, but as long as you get a version number, that means you have correctly installed it. Okay, so how do we actually initialize a Create React App project? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to my desktop, so cd desktop, and then I'm going to say create-react-app followed by the name of the project. So I'm going to call it weather-app, but you can call it whatever you like, and then press enter. So as you can see, as soon as I press enter, it places a folder right about there, and now it's just grabbing all the necessary dependencies that it needs for the configuration. Okay, so once it's done, right about there, it's telling you to first navigate to the project folder and then type in yarn start. So let's just follow the instructions and see what happens. So cd into the weather app and then type in yarn start. It could be npm start in your case, so just type in npm start, it doesn't really matter. And let's see what happens. Okay, so it launches a live server, which in my case is localhost 3000, and there it's a logo and a heading that says welcome to React, and then a line that says to get started, edit source app.js and save to reload. Okay, so let's just go ahead and follow this instruction. So what exactly is inside of this folder? Let's find out. So I'm going to go ahead and open this into my text editor, and I'm going to use Sublime Text for mine, but you can use whatever you want. So right there, I've got some folders that Create React App provides us with. So first up, Node Modules folder. Node Modules folder contains all the dependencies necessary for a project to run. So in this case, there's just millions of them, so I'm not even going to touch them. Next up, public folder, and I will come back to this in a moment. Next up, source folder. The first one, app.css, and I'm going to wipe this clean because I'm going to add my own personal styles. So you can leave it there, you can delete it, it's entirely up to you. But in my case, I'm just gonna clean it because we are going to start with a clean slate. Next up, app.js. Again, I'm gonna select everything and I'm gonna delete it because I'm gonna start from a clean slate so I can explain each and every line to you step by step. Okay, next up, app.test.js. Now this is something to do with testing, but in this video we are not going to go into testing, so I'm just going to leave it there as it is. Okay, next up, index.css. And again, it just contains some basic settings or the basic styles for the web page, so I'm just going to leave them as it is. Next, index.js, and I will come back to this in a moment because I'm not going to delete this. We need these files there, but I will come back to these in a moment, so just close it for now and let's move on. Okay, next up, logo.svg. And this is what you saw on the live server, that logo that was spinning around. But we don't need it, so I'm just going to go ahead and delete it. Okay, next up, register Serviceworker. And this is something to do with progressive web apps, so I'm just going to leave it there as is because we're not going to touch it. And right there, the only file that we are concerned with is package.json, and this contains all the dependencies that this project is using. So in this case is React DOM, and React DOM is a library that, because React can be used outside of the web as well, so there's React Native that we can use for mobile applications. There's React VR that we can use for creating virtual reality applications. So in this case, we are letting this project know that we only need React DOM, which is React Document Object Model. And this is just letting this project know that we are only going to be using the version of React that runs within the web browsers. Okay? Now, next up, app.js. This app.js is probably the main file that we are going to be primarily working with, and a bunch of other components that we're going to create shortly. But in this one, let's just go ahead and actually create a React component. And this React component is going to be the wrapper component that's going to contain all other tiny components that we're going to create. So the first thing that you have to do in a React file is you have to import React from React. This statement is telling this file to import the React object from this React package that lives in package.json. Okay? So once you have imported React, you need to initialize a component. So how do you initialize a component? First, you type in the keyword class, then the name of the component, and I'm just going to call it app, followed by the keyword extends, and then react.component. What this line is doing is the class keyword is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. This app, you can name it whatever you want. You could call it banana if you want, but well, don't call it banana, but just call it something appropriate, but you can call it whatever you want. Now, this class, this is creating an instance of app, and that instance is extending react.component. And react.component is an object that lives in somewhere in Node modules. And yeah, that's all this line is doing. And then you open up the component with a pair of curly braces. Okay. So we have initialized a component, but how do we actually display the data that's going to go inside the component? Well, you use the render method. The render method is a built-in React method that comes inside of React components. And this render method is going to return something called JSX. JSX is not HTML, even though it looks like HTML. It's basically just JavaScript code running in the background. And this is why we need Babel. See, this code, this looks like HTML, but it's not HTML. This is in fact JSX, and then Babel behind the scene converts this into JavaScript that the browsers can understand. So React and Babel are doing a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes just to convert this thing into normal code. Okay, so that render method returns JSX. Now, one thing to note about JSX is that you can only return one parent element. So you cannot return another div or another paragraph. Anything that you want to return has to be within one single div. So let's say that within this div, you have a paragraph that says, come on, hello. And then maybe a h1 that says, see, this emmet is a pain in the ass to work with in React files. So h1 that says yo. And yeah, so this has to be within one parent component. You cannot put this outside like this because React's going to be angry. So make sure that you only return one parent element. And within that parent element, you can put in whatever you want. Okay, now if I save this and I refresh this, and I look back at the screen, I get this big fat error. Index.js export defaults imported as app was not found in app. What this is saying us is back in index.js, we are first importing React from React, then importing React DOM from React, then we are importing this index.css file, and now right there we are trying to import we're trying to import app, the app component from this app file. Yes, we have created this component there, but in order for other files to import this component successfully, we need to first export this right here at the bottom. So I'm going to say export default app. So now I'm telling this file that you need to make this component available for other files to import. And I'm doing this by saying export default followed by the name of the component. So now back here in index.js, I'm importing that component from this file, which lives in the relative path, so app.js. And one thing you need to note is that if you are importing a JavaScript file that you have written, then you can leave off the JS extension. So you are importing the app component from this app file, and then right there you're using react.dom.render method. So react.dom.render, what this is doing is telling this file to render out this component app to this root element, which is document.getElement by ID and then root. And if you go back to index.html, you can see that this div indeed lives right there. So it's grabbing this div and it's telling this file that react.dom.render render out this element to this div. So react.dom.render is essentially a method, and the first argument it takes is the name of the component, and the second argument it takes is the name of or the location of the div or whatever you want to insert your component into. And most of the time it's just one major wrapper div, so you can just leave it there like it is and you'll be good to go. So now if I go back to the browser, I should have hello and yo. Well, you might be thinking that was a lot of effort just to put out hello on the screen, but believe it or not, this is the underlying concept behind React. This is how React works. Okay? So if you remember, in the beginning, we talked about multiple components that we put together into one major component. So in our case, the major component is app. How do we actually go ahead and create our tiny components that we can put inside right there and then render them out? Well, if you remember, we had a titles component, a form component, and a weather component. So let's just go ahead and create them. But I'm not going to go ahead and create these three components within this app.js file, because doing that is just going to kill the whole purpose of React. The purpose of React is to have multiple files that contain the UI code, and then you can import those files into one single file, and then that one single file is what gets exported onto the main index.html, and then that index.html is what you see in the web browser. Okay? So how do we actually create these components? First thing, within the source folder, I'm going to type in, I'm going to create a new folder called components. Within there, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a title component, and that is going to contain the titles for this application. So again, like I said, before you begin, before you even do anything in your React file, you have to first import React from React. Excellent. Okay, so now next thing, class titles extends react.component. Okay, and then react.component, there's going to be a render method, and the render method is going to return a blob of JSX. So right there, I'm going to say I'm going to create a div, and within the div is going to be a h1, and this is going to say weather finder, and then a paragraph tag, and this is going to say find out temperature, conditions, and more. Okay, so again, yes, we are creating this component, but in order for app.js to use this component, we need to first export this and then import this into app.js. So I'm going to say export default titles. Now in app.js, I first need to import this. So import titles from, and then relative path, and it lives in, I need to drill down to components and then titles. So titles.js, and I can leave off the JS extension. So I have imported it, but it's still not going to show up because we've only imported it, but we haven't rendered it out. So remember, whatever we render out is what we get on the screen. So if I want this titles component to show up, I first need to render it. So to insert a component, you type in a self-closing HTML tag, and within there you type in the name of the component. So if I press save now, I get failed to compile, title is not defined. Oh, it's titles, actually, my fault. Okay, so I get weather finder and then the subtitler as well. Excellent. Okay, next up, I had a form component as well. So I'm gonna create a form file, form.js, and again import react from react, and then class form extends react dot component render return, and for now I'm just going to return a div, and I'm going to say form component. So again, I'm going to export this, export default form, and import this into the app.js. So import form from components / form, and I can leave off the extension. So now I need to render this out. So right there I can say form, and there we go, form components. Okay, the last one that we need is the weather component. So new file weather.js. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this and paste it there. So so I'm going to change this to weather. Okay, so back in app.js, I'm going to say import weather from components and then weather. And then last thing I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and render this out. So now I should have all the 3 components that I need for this project. Okay, what next? Well, let's do something more meaningful now. We need to make an API call to a URL, and that URL is going to come from this Open Weather Map website. So before you even do anything, you need to first create an account, and you need to obtain something called an API key. API key or API tokens are a way for websites to know that you are trying to access the data from their database. So when you make an API call to this website, it will get associated to your email account, and then when you make the call, this website is going to use your API to figure out who you are and what kind of data you are trying to access. That is the whole purpose of using API keys. So once you set up an account and then you sign in, so I'm just going to sign in. No, this is create user. I need to sign in. Okay, so I'm going to type my email, my password, and come on. Okay, so if I go to API keys, you should have yours ready over there as well. So please don't copy mine. Just grab yours. It's very quick and it's free. So copy this, and for now, just paste it to your code editor. So just make a const API underscore key and place it right there. Okay. Now, what's the URL that we are going to make the call to? The URL is this one right there. So as you can see, if you try to access this URL, you get an object, and this object itself contains a bunch of more objects that contain a bunch of data. And these properties are what we are going to use to grab the data from this weather API. So as you can see, it has the temperature property, the humidity property, the country, the name of the city, and all that. And this is what we're going to use to grab the data from the website. So I'm going to copy this URL. Okay. So in React components, there's built-in methods as well as the methods of your own that you can create. So I'm going to go ahead and create my own method, and I'm going to call it getWeather. And I'm going to set this to an arrow function. Now, arrow functions were not allowed inside of React components until React 16 arrived, but arrow functions basically allow you to use this keyword independently. So in previous versions of React, you would have to first set up your function like this, and then you would have to set up a constructor, and then within the constructor you would have to bind your method. So you have to do something like this dot get weather equals this dot get weather dot bind dot this. And you still need to do this if you're using any version of React that is below 16. But since the advent of React 16, you can leave off the constructor altogether, and you can just use arrow functions. Now, arrow functions, like I said, they allow you to use this keyword independently. So wherever you use this keyword, it's going to mean that it's bound to this function. So this keyword, wherever it gets called, it's still going to be bound to the component. Okay, so how do we actually make the API call? Well, first of all, I'm going to create a constant called API underscore call. And now I'm going to use something called Async Await. Async Await is a great way of making HTTP calls, and it just makes making web requests extremely easy. So watch how easy it is. Right before you declare the function, put in the keyword async, and then when you are actually going to make the call, type in await. And in this case, I'm going to use the fetch API to make the API call. Fetch API is one of the newer method in JavaScript. So all you need to do there is you type in the fetch keyword followed by a pair of parentheses, and then in there you just throw in the URL that you want to make the call to. Now, in this case, I need to inject this API key as well as the values for the country and the city. So I'm going to use something called template strings. Template strings are just normal strings, but they allow you to inject the variables that you have defined within your files. So I'm going to paste my URL in there. Okay, and I'm going to, this APPID is where the API key goes. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all this right about till there, and I'm going to replace this with this constant. So APPID equals $, curly braces, and then this one right there. Okay, but this is not going to do anything just yet because we are only creating a variable that makes the call, that contains a function that makes a call to this URL. Okay, the very next thing that we need to do after we have made the API call is we need to convert the response to JSON format. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and essentially it just converts the data that we get back from the API to a readable format that any programming language can understand. That's all JSON does. So to do that, I'm going to say const data equals await, and then whatever we get back from this API is going to get converted to JSON with this method. So API call .json and then parentheses. So you might be used to seeing something like json.parse or json.stringify, and this is still useful, but watch how easy this is in Fetch API. All you need to do is you need to pass in the variable, and then you just call the JSON method on it, and boom, you're good to go. Okay, so again, we have made a constant that's taking in a function that's making the API call, and then we are converting the API call to JSON format, and we are assigning that to a constant called data. Okay, but what do we actually do with this data? Let's think about it. So currently, all I can do is I can just console.log this file, this constant, but it's not going to do anything because we are only declaring this function there. We are not actually calling it anywhere. So how do we actually make sure that this function gets called? Well, this is a bit of a problem then, isn't it? Now I'm going to introduce you to props. But before I do that, I need to fill out this form component. So return a form. And I don't need the action, so I can just delete it. And right there, I'm going to create a couple of inputs. So input, oops, what's that done? Okay, input type equals text, and then I'm going to give it a name attribute. The name attribute is what we are going to use to fetch the values out of these inputs. So the first one's going to be the city. Placeholder equals city, and then I'm just going to go ahead and copy these and paste them right there. So this one's going to be the country, and this one's going to be the country as well. And the last thing that I need for this is a button, because I need to submit it somehow. So button get weather. Okay, brilliant. So let's see if that's showing up. It's not showing up. So import weather from weather.js const. Okay. So what's broken there? Okay, unexpected token. So this is on source app.js line number 7. App.js line 7. Oh, okay. There we go. That should fix it. Okay, so I am getting the input back and the button, but it's not going to do anything just yet. So how do we actually make sure that when we press this button, this function gets called? Well, I'm going to use something called props. Props are pretty much like HTML attributes, so you can name them whatever you want. In my case, I'm going to call mine getWeather, and I'm going to pass this onto form component. So this form component will have access to the props in this form.js file. So the props name is going to be same as this, getWeather, and it's going to get set to a JavaScript expression, and this is going to say this. This refers to this app component, so this dot getWeather. So all we are doing here is we are setting up a prop and we are setting its value to this function. And since we are setting this up in this form component, that means we have access to this function now in form. Okay, so that means we can now use this method using something called this.props dot the name of the prop. So here I can say on click or on submit actually, because when we press the button, this form is going to get submit. So I'm going to say on submit equals this dot props dot get weather. Okay, so now again we are defining a method, we are making the API call, and then we're trying to console.log whatever we get back from the API. And then in the form component, we are setting up a prop called getWeather, and we are setting its value to this function. And then back in form.js, we are setting up a React attribute called onSubmit. What this is going to do is it's going to call in this.props.getWeather, which is this one right there. So let's see if that works. I'm going to open up my console, and if I press this button, I don't get back anything just yet. And the reason for that is, watch what happens as soon as I press this button. Keep an eye on this file icon right there. So if I press the button, we go through a full page refresh. So the object appears for a while, the response from the API appears for a while, but then it disappears because we go through a full page refresh. Now, to prevent a full page refresh, it's very simple. Give it an argument called e, and this is nothing specific to React. This e is just event object in JavaScript. So you can say e.prevent default. What this is going to do is it's going to prevent the default behavior of this component when we press the button. Okay, so now if I press the button, I get this object back. Okay, and in this object, there's a bunch of properties that you can use to get the data out, and that is exactly what we are going to do. And this is very important, what we just did, e.prevent default, because e.prevent default signifies single page applications, and we basically use React to create single page applications. So yeah, we are all good to go now. So now that we are successfully getting back this data in the console, what do we do next? Because we don't need this in the console, we need this on our UI on the screen. So how do we actually make sure that whatever we get back from the API gets displayed to the screen? Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change these hard-coded values to dynamic values, because we don't always want this to be Manchester and this to be UK. So how do I do that? Well, if you remember, in form.js, we set up something called name attributes in the input. So we have the city name and then the country name. And we are going to use this name attribute to access the values of these inputs. So back in app.js, I can use this event object to grab the value. So I'm going to set up a constant, const city equals e.target.elements.name, and then the name for the first one is city, and then its value, and this value is whatever we type into the input. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and paste it right there. I'm going to say const city, and I'm going to change this to country, so COUNTRY, country. Okay, so now how do I actually put these values into this URL? So right there it says a query string, and then the first one is name of the city. So in this case it's Manchester. So I'm going to replace this with a variable city, and the one next to it is the name of the country. So I'm going to replace this with country. Okay. So now let's see if that works. If I type in the name of the city, Manchester, UK, let's see what we get back. We get back cannot read property city of undefined. So e.target.elements.name.city.value. Okay, so what's happening there? Let's go back to form. Name equals city, name equals country, and in app.js, e.target.elements.name. Oh, I shouldn't have added name because name is what we are using to access the values. So my mistake, just forget the name. Okay, so now we should be all right for this. So Manchester, UK, get weather. And if I expand this object, you can see it's Manchester there. But we were getting Manchester already, so let's try something different. I'm going to type in London there. And I get another object. So right there you can see it says London, and there it says Manchester, so that means that our inputs are working perfectly fine. Okay, so like I said, I don't want to display these values in the console. I want to display them on the screen. So now I'm going to introduce you to something called state. State is an object that lives within a component, and it's responsible for keeping track of changing data within a component. So that change could be the result of a user interaction, maybe a user clicking a button or a user submitting a form, but generally it's just some sort of interaction with the application that causes the data to change. Okay, so how do we actually initialize the state? We say state equals an object. Now, if you have worked with React before, then you might remember doing something like this, like setting up a constructor and then passing in the props and then saying super props and then this dot state equals to an object. But this has been deprecated in React 16. Like I said, in React 16 you can just ditch the constructor altogether and you can just begin working with state or your methods right away. So state is an object, okay? And this object contains key value pairs. So let's think about it for now. What do we actually need? We need the temperature, which is this right there. We need the name of the city. We need the name of the country, and then we need humidity as well. And we also need this description. Okay, so we need 5 pieces of state. To describe the state, I'm going to say temperature. And this is something called the initial state. Okay, this is the initial state of the object. And the state is only going to change once we press the button. Okay, so for now, let's just say undefined. Next up, let's give the state property called city. This is going to be undefined as well. Next one, let's give it a country. This is going to be undefined as well. Next up, humidity. Again, undefined. Description, undefined. And let's give it an error property as well. And we will come back to the error in a moment. So right now, just follow along. And yeah, so this is our states that we need. So temperature, city, country, humidity, description, and error. Okay, so now that we have all this defined, how do we actually make sure that this state contains whatever we get back from the API? So right here in the function, I'm going to set the values of this states. So now you may be tempted to do something like this: dot state, dot temperature, equals blah blah blah, whatever you get back from the API. But no, don't ever do that. Don't ever directly manipulate the state. Okay, bad practice. Use a method called setState. So in React, there's a built-in method called setState. So this dot setState, and this contains an object, and within there you can describe your state values. So in this case, temperature. Now, what do I want to set it to? Well, if we go back to, let's just do a quick console.log. If we go back to the console, where does the temperature live? So this main object is the data object because this is what we have declared right there. So to access anything, we have to start with data dot and then anything we want to access. So what do we actually want here? Well, so data dot and then the temperature lives in this main object. So data dot main dot temp. Okay, data dot main dot temp. So now we have successfully updated the value of our temperature state once we press the button. Okay, next up, city. Where does the city live? So data dot it's just name, data dot name. Okay, next up, country. So data dot sys dot country. Okay, data dot sys dot country. And this is just the basic bare bones of working with APIs. All you need to do is you just need to find your ways of the properties, and then you need to work your way through. That's all it is to APIs. Okay, and next up we have description, humidity, and this lives in data.main humidity. So data.main.humidity. Next up, description. So description equals light. So data dot weather. So this is a bit different because this is returning an object. This is returning an array. So we need to select the index of 0, and then within the index we need to select the property called description. So data dot is the weather object, so weather. And then the weather object contains an array. So that array is the index of 0. So data.weather 0.description. Excellent. Okay, and for now, we can just leave the error undefined or an empty string. It doesn't matter. And like I said, we will come back to this in a moment. Okay, so now that we are actually getting this response, how do we actually make sure that the value of all these states is displayed right there on the screen? Now, this is where we are going to use the weather component. Currently, it just says weather component, and I'm going to get rid of this. So, how do we actually pass these values to the weather component? Well, if you're thinking that we're going to use props, then you're right. So, right there, I'm going to say temperature equals a JavaScript expression, this dot state dot temperature. Okay, I'm going to split this up into multiple lines because it's going to be a bit of a long one. So temperature next up city equals this dot state dot city. Next up country, this dot state dot country. Okay, and next one's humidity, so equals a JavaScript expression, this dot state dot humidity. Next up's description equals this dot state dot description. And let's also pass in the error. So this dot state dot error. So now that we have defined all these props, that means that we have access to these props in the weather.js file. So right there, if I say this dot props dot temperature, let's see what we get back. Currently, we don't get anything back because, as I said, in the beginning, the values of these states is undefined, so nothing is going to show up. The values of these states change only when we press this button. So if I say Manchester, UK, and I press the button, get weather, I get this temperature displaying right here on the screen. And this is fantastic. Okay, so let's just do the same for the other values as well. So this dot props dot temperature, this dot props dot city. Actually, let's just do it in a more symmetrical way. So the first one's going to be this dot props dot city, and then this dot props dot country. Okay, I messed it up. Well, never mind. Okay, this dot props dot humidity. Next up, this dot props dot, I believe it's description. Yeah. Okay, let's see if we get all these values back. So Manchester, UK, get weather. So Manchester, Great Britain, 0.31, 100% humidity and mist. Okay, so we are correctly getting all these back. Let's just go ahead and change this component a little bit. So I'm going to say this is location, and this is going to be just one single line. So this dot props dot city followed by the name of the country, so location, and then this is going to be temperature, so, and then a JavaScript expression, and this is going to get set to this. This is going to be humidity, so, and paste it there. And the last one's description, so I'm just going to say conditions and paste it right there. Okay, but now we have a problem because we are getting these empty keys without a value, but we only want these to display once we press the button. How do we do that? Well, first of all, let's just turn these into paragraph tags so we know that what we are doing. Okay. So p tag, just so they show up on a separate line. So that's the only reason I'm doing it. So last one, p tag, and so yeah, these are still showing up. I don't want these to show up until I press this button. So how do I make sure that this doesn't happen? Well, you might be thinking that we could do something like if this dot props dot temperature equals true, then render out the paragraph. But no, these if-else statements and all these pure JavaScripty things, they don't exist in React. They're not allowed in React. So to do this, we have to make use of something called AND operator, okay, or conditional operators. So we can say, starting our sentence with a JavaScript expression, we can say if this dot props dot city and this dot props dot country, only then do we want to display this paragraph. So what this is doing is it's saying that if this dot props dot city returns true, if this dot props dot country returns true, and only then do we want to display this paragraph. So if you are familiar with the AND operator, it means that all of the conditions have to be true in order for it to execute. So in this case, we are getting the city back when we press the button, we are getting the country back when we press the button, And when these two conditions meet, we get this paragraph rendering out. Okay, so I'm going to do the same for the temperature as well. So starting with a curly brace, this dot props dot temperature, and render out the paragraph. So if this dot props dot temperature exists, render out the paragraph. Okay, same for this one. This dot props dot humidity, then render out the paragraph. Last one. This dot props dot condition, then actually I think it's this dot props dot description. Yeah, this dot props dot description, then render out this paragraph right there. So now if I go back, I can see that all of those paragraphs have disappeared. So now if I type in the city and the country and I press get weather, and this is what we want it to do. So this is working brilliantly. Brilliantly. Okay, sorry, it's literally 3 o'clock at night and my brain is a mush right now, so pardon me for any mistakes. But we have a problem. What if the user tries to press this button without entering the values? Let's do that. Get weather. There we go. Our application breaks. It says cannot read property of undefined. And the reason it's saying this is because, as you can see right here at the beginning, the temperature is undefined. And then right there we're trying to fetch the data that of something that's not even been called, because if the city and the country don't exist, then it's not going to be able to know what we are trying to get back from the API, and that in return is going to give us an error. Okay, and we don't want that. So to get rid of this, we can make a check. So right about there, just before we set the state and console.log the data, I can say if city and country, then run this code. What this is doing is we are making a check that if city, so if city's value has been entered, so if this returns true and this returns true as well, only then do we want to render out this code. Otherwise, do nothing for now. So if these values exist, then it's going to return true, and if it's an empty string, then in JavaScript an empty string returns a false. So if these two return a false, then this code is not going to work. So now if we go back to our code and we try to access the weather without entering any values, as you can see, it's not going to work. It's going to give a error in the console, but otherwise it's not going to work. The application itself is not going to break. Okay, excellent. Now, next up, if this is working, if we get the return from these values, then we want to return true, then we want this code to run. Else, let's just make use of this error state right there. Else, I'm going to go ahead and copy all this, paste it there, and I'm going to get rid of all these. I'm going to set it back to undefined. This one, because if we are getting false data, then we don't really need to access all these values back. Do you know what I mean? So this one's going to say, please enter the values. So how do we actually show this error on the form, on the weather? So if you remember, we passed this error as a prop to the weather component. So right there I can say if weather, if error exists. So if this dot props dot error, then render out this dot props dot error. Okay, let's see if that works. So if I try submitting this form without any values, I get this error back. So please enter the value. Excellent. Okay, now if I try to go ahead and fill in the values and press the button, I get the correct response. So location, Manchester, Great Britain. Temperature is very cold at the moment, 0.31. Humidity 100%, and condition is still misty. Let's try it another one. London. Okay, so it's not working again. Cannot read property temp of undefined. So did I press in the right location? London, UK. Oh, I probably mistyped something. Okay, so London, UK, we're getting this back correctly. So if I type in New York, and right there I say US, come on. Right there I say US, I press get weather, I get the weather for New York. Okay, and this is fantastic. So this is pretty much all that we needed to do. So again, let's just do a recap of how we worked with this application. So first up, we created a React component called app. We rendered out a few dummy components to start with. And then after that, we created a method called getWeather, and we did a bunch of stuff in there. We first made the API call, we converted it to JSON, and then we grabbed the values of the input forms that we have, and then we set the states of the state defined above there. So after that, we made sure that the values were entered correctly. If they weren't entered, then we are going to render out this error. Okay, now right there in the form, we passed in a prop getWeather, and we set its value to this function. So this function is going to run every time this button is pressed. Back in weather.js, we are rendering out these tiny paragraphs based on the presence of these props. So if these props exist, only then these paragraphs are going to get rendered. Now, there's a bunch of things we could improve about our application. So the React components can be of two types. There's class-based components, which we have used in all the files, and there's stateless functional components. Now, stateless functional components, as the very name describes it, they don't contain state. So stateless functional components, they don't contain any state. So how do we actually work with stateless functional components? So in the app component, we do have state going on. So we need it to be a class-based component. But those components that do not contain any state, they don't need to import all these class properties. They don't need all this functionality just to render out some UI on the screen. So to make this simple, I'm going to cut this out. And to begin a stateless functional component, you type in const, followed by the name of the component, and then you initialize it using the arrow function, and then right there you say return, and you just paste it right there, and there we go. Like I said, this is not necessary. This is just to make your code a little, a bit more decent, so you don't have to input unnecessary functionality in your files. But we have a problem. Currently, this is not going to work, and let me tell you why. So it gives us a big fat error. Cannot read property city of undefined. Now, if you go back to weather.js, you see we are using something called this.props. Now first off, since we have deleted the class keyword, that means we cannot use the this keyword anymore. Okay, not in the return statement at least. So how do we fix this? I mean, we have the this keyword as well as this props. I mean, where's this props coming from? There's no mention of props in this function. So we need to fix this. So first of all, let's just go ahead and get rid of this keyword, okay? So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and set multiple cursors. So this, and then this, there. It's going to be a fair bit of this, so I do apologize. Okay, so nearly there. Right, second last and then last. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all of these, but we still have a problem because we are still trying to access the props within the component, and it says the props is not defined. So in order to make sure that this works, we have to give it an argument called props. So if I say props there, and if I save, there we go, it's working back to normal. So another thing that we can improve is if in arrow functions you are only returning one single element, which in this case is the div. Now don't mistake these for multiple elements, because at the end of the day we are only returning one single root element, which is this one single div right there. So if you are only returning one single element, you can actually explicitly return it by getting rid of the return keyword and the curly braces and replace it with a pair of parentheses. This means that you are explicitly returning something from the arrow function. So you can paste it right there, and there we go. Yet another thing, if you are only returning one single argument in an arrow function, then you can even get rid of these parentheses. So watch how neat this is. This is a lot more readable than what we have had in the past. So going back to the app, making sure that it's working as expected. Yes, it is. So let's just go ahead and convert the rest of the components into stateless functional components. Okay, so in form.js, do we have any state? Nope. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out, delete all this, and I'm going to say const form equals props, and then I'm going to explicitly return this one single form element. So I'm just going to put it there, format it back, and there we go. Next up, titles. Do we have any state in there? Nope. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this, delete all this, and I'm going to say const titles equals. In this case, we don't really need any props, so I'm going to have to put the parentheses there. So right there, I'm going to say, there we go. Okay. So cannot read property get weather of undefined. So form.onSubmit equals, oh, I forgot to exclude the this keyword. So there we go. Now it should work. So again, testing it out. First of all, let's just try submit the empty form. So again, this returns an error. And if I enter the values and I press this get weather, I get what I want. So let's just get rid of this console.log as well. So yeah, there it is. Okay, so this is all that we need as far as the logic of this app goes. So we needed a input to work properly, we needed the state to work properly, and we needed the props to work properly, and these are all working just fine. Okay, that's all that we needed to do. Now in the next video, I'm going to go ahead and add the styling to this application. So by styling, I mean I've already defined all the styles. I'm just going to go ahead and add some class names to these divs and all these elements right there. So if you want to watch me do that, then come with me to the next video. If not, then I hope you learned something from it. I hope that solidified your React understanding. And you can make this app more functional. You can grab a bunch more values from the API, and you can work with, you can add more functionality to this app. So the main reason of this video was to show you how to work with APIs in React, rather than just creating a simple to-do list application. So I hope you learned something from it, and if you liked it, just let me know on the DM on Instagram. And if you want to watch me create something more, like more of these tutorials, then let me know what you want to create next with me, and I'll be happy to do that. So again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.